I was standing by my father's graveside, watching the casket being lowered into the frozen Chicago ground, when my wife Savannah walked up to me with an envelope in her hands. The November wind was cutting through my black coat, and I could smell the fresh earth mixed with the scent of dying leaves. The timing couldn't have been worse, but looking back, I think that was exactly the point. My name is Preston Clark, and I'm 59 years old. For the past 24 years, I've been running Clark Commercial Properties, the company my father built from nothing here in Chicago's financial district. We manage office buildings and retail spaces across the Midwest, and our reputation in the commercial real estate world is rock solid. My analytical mind and ability to read people have always been my greatest assets in both business and life. I thought I had a solid marriage with Savannah. We'd been together for 20 years, and she seemed to understand the family business and everything that came with it. Our two sons, Marshall, 18, and Bryce, 16, were everything to me. Or at least I thought they were everything to her, too. Marshall was finishing his senior year at Lincoln Park High, already accepted to DePaul's business program. Bryce was the athlete of the family, captain of his hockey team, and talking about following his brother into business someday. My father had been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial had given us the timeline, and we all knew the end was coming. Dad had always treated Savannah like his own daughter, especially after her parents died in that car accident during our 3rd year of marriage. I could see how much his approval meant to her throughout our marriage, how she'd light up when he praised her interior design work or asked her opinion about company matters. That's why what happened at his funeral hit me like a freight train rolling through downtown Chicago. "Preston," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. The other mourners were still gathered around, their black umbrellas creating a sea of darkness against the gray November sky. "I need you to sign these." I opened the envelope with hands that were already numb from the cold, and my blood ran even colder. Divorce papers. Right there with dirt still clinging to my Italian leather shoes from standing beside my father's grave. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd taught me everything about building something lasting was being laid to rest while my wife was trying to tear apart everything we'd built together. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, keeping my voice low. People were still around us. Clients, employees, family friends who'd driven in from the suburbs to pay their respects. The last thing I wanted was to create a scene at my father's funeral. "The timing isn't ideal, but this needed to happen," she replied, and there was something in her tone that I'd never heard before, a coldness that matched the Chicago wind whipping across the cemetery. "According to your father's will, certain family assets transferred to me as the surviving daughter-in-law. My attorney says the provisions are ironclad." Before I could even begin to process what she was really saying, Marshall and Bryce walked up behind her. My own sons, the boys I'd coached in Little League, taught to drive, helped with homework countless nights. They looked at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Cold, almost disgusted, like I was some stranger who disappointed them beyond measure. "Dad, we've made our decision," Marshall announced, his voice loud enough for several family friends to hear. Mrs. Patterson from Dad's church turned to stare, her face a mixture of shock and pity. "We're changing our last name to Reed. Mom's partner has offered us opportunities you never could." The words hit me harder than any business deal gone wrong, any client lost to a competitor. These were my sons, my blood, the future of everything my family had built over 3 generations. Bryce nodded in agreement, his hockey team confidence replaced by something that looked rehearsed. "We want to live with Mom and Colton. He understands us better than you ever did. He says we've got potential you never saw." Colton Reed, my CFO of 7 years, the man I'd trusted with access to our most sensitive financial systems, our client relationships, our company's future. The guy who'd sat at our dinner table during holidays, who'd helped Marshall with his business school applications, who'd driven Bryce to hockey tournaments when I was stuck in client meetings. Standing there in my black suit, surrounded by mourners and the smell of fresh flowers wilting in the cold, I felt something inside me shift. Not anger. Anger is hot and impulsive, the kind of emotion that makes you say things you regret or throw punches that land you in legal trouble. This was something entirely different, something colder, more calculated, like the methodical thinking that had helped me grow our commercial real estate portfolio from $30 million to $120 million over the past decade. The same strategic mindset that had built our empire was now turning its full attention to this betrayal. But here's what Savannah didn't know. What none of them realized as they stood there in that cemetery thinking they'd caught me completely off guard. I'd been watching this betrayal unfold for months. When you run a property management company, when you're responsible for millions of dollars in other people's real estate investments, you develop certain instincts about deception and unusual patterns. Your survival depends on reading between the lines, on catching the small inconsistencies that signal bigger problems. And Savannah's behavior had been setting off every alarm bell I'd developed over 2 decades in Chicago commercial real estate since early spring. It started with the small things, the kind of details that most husbands might overlook but that someone in my line of work couldn't ignore. She'd become protective of her phone, angling the screen away when texting, taking calls in the other room when she used to answer everything right in front of me. She started working late at her interior design consultancy more frequently, claiming new clients were keeping her busy. But when I called her office, her assistant Sarah would say she'd left hours earlier. There were unexplained charges on our joint credit card. Dinners at expensive restaurants downtown, the kind of places where a bottle of wine costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. When she'd told me she was home with a headache. Hotel charges that she claimed were for client meetings. But when I casually asked about her projects, the timelines never quite matched up. But the real red flag was Colton Reed himself. He'd joined our company 7 years ago when we expanded into commercial consulting services. Colton was everything you'd expect from a Northwestern MBA. Smooth, charming, articulate, and he had legitimate skills that had helped us land several major property management contracts. He specialized in business development and client relations. And honestly, he was good at his job. Too good, as it turned out. But over the past 10 months, since around the time my father's cancer diagnosis became serious, Colton had been asking questions about our financial structure that went far beyond his responsibilities as CFO. These weren't casual inquiries, they were systematic, methodical, like someone conducting due diligence for an acquisition. "Hey Preston," he'd casually mentioned during our monthly executive meetings, "I've been thinking about the company's asset allocation. How much of our liquid capital is tied up in that downtown property portfolio your dad assembled back in the 80s? Or he'd drop by my office on a Friday afternoon, lean against my desk with that MBA confidence and say, "Your father was absolutely brilliant with those early investments. I bet the family trust is worth more than the actual business operations now, right?" Just trying to understand our overall financial picture for the strategic planning session. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, maybe trying to impress me with his analytical thinking, the kind of ambitious young executive behavior you see all the time in Chicago's financial district. Now I understood he was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for whatever plan he and Savannah had been hatching. The breakthrough that changed everything came in August, during one of the hottest weeks of the summer. Our IT department flagged unusual access patterns in our computer system. Someone had been accessing client files, financial records, and property management data outside normal business hours. The digital forensics were crystal clear. It was Colton's login credentials, but the access times coincided with evenings and weekends when he should have been home with his girlfriend, or so I thought. That's when I made the decision to start my own quiet investigation. I hired a private investigator named Spencer Walsh, a former Chicago PD detective who'd specialized in white-collar crime before going into private practice. Spencer had that weathered look of a guy who'd seen everything the city had to offer, the good, the bad, and the ugly. More importantly, he had connections throughout the financial district and knew how to conduct surveillance without being detected. Within 3 weeks, Spencer had delivered photographic evidence that shattered any remaining illusions I might have had about my marriage. Savannah and Colton meeting at the Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago, not once, but multiple times over several months. The photos were damning: intimate dinners, walking hand in hand through Millennium Park, entering and leaving hotel rooms together. But Spencer wasn't finished. The real bombshell came when he discovered they'd been meeting with a probate attorney named Stephanie Davis, a woman with a reputation for finding creative interpretations of inheritance law, particularly in cases involving family businesses and complex trust structures. Stephanie specialized in what she euphemistically called asset optimization during family transitions. In plain English, she helped people figure out how to get their hands on money that wasn't necessarily meant for them. I realized this wasn't just an affair. This was a full-scale conspiracy to take over everything my family had built. My father's will did include provisions that seemed to benefit Savannah, He genuinely loved her, had walked her down the aisle at our wedding when her own father couldn't be there, considered her the daughter he'd never had. But those provisions were contingent on specific circumstances that I knew hadn't been met. However, if they could manipulate the legal interpretation and gain control of both my personal assets and my controlling shares in Clark Commercial Properties, they could effectively force me out of my own business. The manipulation of Marshall and Bryce was perhaps the cruelest part of their plan. Over the course of several months, Colton had been systematically positioning himself as the cool, understanding father figure who really got them in ways their old man apparently didn't. He'd take them shopping with his company credit card, buying them designer clothes and expensive electronics. He promised Marshall a BMW for graduation, told Bryce he'd get him a Mercedes C-Class when he turned 18. He painted vivid pictures of their future: private schools, unlimited college funds, European vacations during spring break, internships at major corporations through his network of contacts. All the things that a successful businessman's sons should expect, but that their father was apparently too conservative and old-fashioned to provide. "Your dad's stuck in the past," I overheard him telling Bryce during a family barbecue in September, when I'd stepped into the kitchen to get more drinks. "He doesn't understand what young men need to succeed in today's world. When I have more influence over the family finances, you'll see what real opportunities look like. We'll travel to Europe, check out some international business programs. Your father thinks small. I think global." The worst part was watching how my sons responded to this manipulation. These were good kids, smart kids, but they were teenagers dealing with the stress of their grandfather's illness, their father's long work hours managing a growing business, and now this charismatic figure promising them everything they thought they wanted. I documented everything Spencer uncovered, every suspicious meeting, every financial irregularity, every pattern that suggested coordination between Savannah and Colton. I consulted with my own attorney, Natalie Brooks, a sharp woman who specialized in business law and had handled several high-profile corporate fraud cases in the Chicago area. Natalie had that no-nonsense approach that comes from years of dealing with people who think they're smarter than the law. "Preston," Natalie told me during a confidential meeting in her downtown office in October, the autumn light filtering through her windows overlooking the Chicago River. "If they're planning what you think they're planning, they're going to have to commit several federal crimes to pull it off. Wire fraud, embezzlement, possibly even racketeering if they're coordinating this conspiracy across state lines with business partners or financial institutions." But I couldn't act on any of this yet. My father was deteriorating rapidly, and any family scandal would have destroyed him emotionally during his final months. Dad loved Savannah genuinely. She'd become the daughter he'd never had after her parents died. He'd spent hours teaching her about the family business, sharing stories about the early days when he was building Clark Commercial Properties from a single storefront office. The thought of her betraying not just me, but everything he'd worked to create would have broken his heart completely. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I waited, I watched, and I prepared. I quietly restructured my personal assets, working with a different attorney that Natalie recommended, someone Savannah had never met and knew nothing about. I moved money into accounts that existed only in my name, set up trusts that protected the core business assets, and created financial firewalls that would prevent any unauthorized access to company funds. I documented every irregularity in Colton's behavior and preserved all the digital evidence Spencer had gathered. Most importantly, I worked with our IT department to set up monitoring systems that would track any unauthorized attempts to access or transfer company funds. The hardest part wasn't the financial maneuvering or even the evidence gathering. It was acting normal around my own family. Sitting at dinner every night, listening to my sons talk excitedly about their future plans that had been planted in their heads by a man who was systematically robbing their family business. Watching Savannah play the devoted wife, asking about my day, expressing concern about my father's declining health, all while she was planning to rob me blind and destroy everything we'd built together. Marshall would come home from school talking about the business internships Colton had promised to arrange, the networking opportunities he'd provide, the contacts in major corporations who were apparently waiting to meet my son. Bryce would show me brochures for expensive prep schools that Colton claimed would give him advantages I couldn't provide, hockey camps in Canada that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Dad, Colton thinks I should apply to some international business programs," Marshall said one evening in October, his homework spread across the kitchen table. "He says you're too focused on local markets, But the real opportunities are global. He's got connections in London and Singapore. That's interesting, I replied, keeping my voice neutral while internally noting another piece of evidence. What kind of global opportunities does he have in mind? Real estate development in emerging markets. He says the Clark name could open doors internationally if we think bigger. Marshall's enthusiasm was heartbreaking because it was genuine. My son genuinely believed this man was looking out for his future. Bryce was even more direct in his admiration. Colton understands what guys our age want, he told me after another of Colton's mentoring sessions at some expensive restaurant downtown. He doesn't lecture us about responsibility and hard work all the time. He shows us what success actually looks like. But patience is a virtue in business, especially in commercial real estate where the best deals often take months or even years to develop properly. The best con artists, the most sophisticated financial criminals, always reveal themselves when they think they're safe, when they believe their targets are completely unsuspecting. I just had to wait for Colton and Savannah to make their move. The funeral was on Thursday, November 15th. By the following Tuesday morning, Colton and Savannah had made their first major mistake. I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., as was my habit, to review overnight messages and prepare for the day ahead. Our building in the financial district was still quiet, with only security staff and a few early arrivals like myself present. I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing monthly reports and sipping coffee that was still too hot, when our acting CFO, Kelly Johnson, knocked on my door with an expression that immediately put me on alert. I'd quietly brought Kelly in as a financial consultant 2 months earlier, ostensibly to help with our expansion planning, but really to serve as an additional set of eyes on our accounting systems. She was a CPA with 15 years of experience in commercial real estate, and she had the kind of sharp attention to detail that catches irregularities other people miss. "Preston, we have a serious problem," she said, closing the door behind her and setting a folder of documents on my desk. "Someone initiated a wire transfer authorization over the weekend for $180,000 from our main operating account to a consulting firm I've never heard of." Even though I'd been expecting something like this, actually seeing it happen sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. This was it. They'd finally made their move. "Show me everything," I said, though I already knew what I'd find. The transfer request bore Colton's digital signature and was dated for the previous Saturday, just 4 days after my father's funeral. The receiving company was listed as Midwest Strategic Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware, one of those shell companies that exist only on paper, designed to obscure the real destination of transferred funds. The timing was calculated and callous. They'd waited just long enough after the funeral to make it seem like normal business activity. "Kelly, I need you to freeze all external transfers immediately and call our primary bank," I instructed, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "Tell them we're conducting an internal security audit and need a 48-hour hold on any transactions over $25,000. "Should I notify Colton about the freeze?" she asked, already knowing the answer but wanting confirmation. "Not yet. Let's see how he reacts when he discovers it on his own." I didn't have to wait long. The trap I'd been setting for months was about to snap shut, and Colton was going to walk right into it. Colton stormed into my office at 10:45 that morning, his usual composed MBA demeanor completely shattered. His face was flushed, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd been running his hands through his hair, and there was a desperation in his eyes that I'd never seen before. This was a man who'd just discovered that his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. "Preston, what the hell is going on with our banking systems?" he demanded, not even bothering with pleasantries or condolences about my father. "I have a time-sensitive consulting contract that needs to be funded today, and the bank is giving me some runaround about account freezes and security audits." I leaned back in my chair, studying him with the same analytical approach I used when evaluating potential property investments. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colton," I replied calmly. "What kind of consulting contract requires a $180,000 transfer to a Delaware shell company on a weekend, especially just 4 days after my father's funeral?" His face went completely pale. The color drained so quickly I thought he might actually pass out right there in my office. He realized I knew everything, and more importantly that I'd been watching and waiting for him to make exactly this kind of mistake. "It's a legitimate business expense for the Henderson Industries account," he stammered, but his voice had lost all conviction. We discussed expanding our property management services to include strategic consulting. This is part of that initiative. Did we? I asked, pulling out a file folder that contained months of documentation. Because I don't recall any conversation about Henderson Industries, and they're based in Milwaukee. Why would they need Delaware consulting services? And why would you authorize a transfer without my signature or board approval? Colton opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in the 7 years I'd known him, the smooth-talking MBA was completely speechless. I think you should clean out your office, I said quietly. Security will escort you out within the hour. He left my office without another word, and I immediately called Natalie Brooks. It's time, I told her. They just attempted the wire fraud we've been expecting. By Friday afternoon, Natalie had filed preliminary injunctions, freezing all joint assets, pending a comprehensive forensic accounting investigation. More importantly, she'd contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division here in Chicago. Agent Sarah Martinez, a specialist in white-collar crime, was very interested in what we'd discovered. The beautiful thing about financial fraud, especially in the digital age, is that it always leaves a trail. Every access, every transfer, every unauthorized login gets recorded somewhere. And when you're married to someone who runs a property management company with sophisticated security systems, that trail becomes very easy to follow. The forensic accountants that the FBI brought in discovered that Colton and Savannah had been systematically siphoning money from our business for 8 months. They'd created fake maintenance contracts with companies that existed only on paper, inflated vendor invoices and pocketed the difference, and even set up phantom consulting agreements to collect fees from our actual clients. The total amount exceeded $580,000, which elevated their crimes to federal felony territory. But the most damning evidence came from their own communications. Remember those company phones and laptops we provided to all our executives? Everything was backed up to our secure servers, including personal communications sent through company devices. Every text message, every email, every phone call between Savannah and Colton was preserved in perfect digital clarity. The transcripts were devastating. Savannah discussing how she'd played the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly to gain my father's trust, how she'd timed the divorce papers for maximum emotional impact. Colton bragging about how easy it was to manipulate the old man's guilt about working long hours, how he'd slowly turned my sons against me by positioning himself as the understanding father figure I supposedly wasn't. They even joked about my children, referring to them as useful leverage and emotional ammunition for the divorce proceedings. When Marshall and Bryce found out their mother and her boyfriend had referred to them that way, their attitude changed dramatically and immediately. Bryce came to me crying one evening in December after the FBI had shown him some of the transcripts as part of their investigation. Dad, I saw what they really thought about us. They called us leverage. They didn't care about us at all, did they? No, son, I replied, pulling him into the kind of hug I should have been giving more often during those difficult months. They saw you and your brother as tools to use against me. But that's not your fault. You were manipulated by people you trusted, people who were supposed to care about your well-being. Marshall was harder to reach initially, but when the FBI arrested Colton at our office in front of several employees and clients, the reality finally sank in. His hero worship of Colton crumbled completely when he saw him in handcuffs on the Channel 7 Evening News. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story, Clark Properties executives charged in $580K embezzlement scheme. The article detailed how a trusted CFO and the company founder's daughter-in-law had systematically defrauded the family business while the patriarch was dying of cancer. But something unexpected happened. Our clients didn't abandon us. They rallied around Clark Commercial Properties, seeing the story as proof of our financial oversight capabilities and ethical standards. After all, we'd caught the criminals using our own security systems and turned them over to federal authorities. Several new management contracts came in within weeks of the arrests, including a major deal with a downtown office complex that significantly expanded our portfolio. Savannah's assets were frozen, including the house she'd assumed would be hers through inheritance manipulation. She had to move in with her sister in Naperville and take a job at a customer service call center to pay for her legal defense. The woman who'd been planning European vacations and luxury shopping sprees was suddenly working for $15 an hour and taking the train to work every morning. Colton lost his MBA credentials when the fraud conviction went on his record. No reputable company in the commercial real estate industry would hire him. Last I heard, he was selling used cars at a lot in Rockford, a long way from the global business opportunities he'd been promising my sons. The probate court ruled that Savannah's actions constituted financial elder abuse against my father, which automatically disqualified her from receiving any inheritance benefits whatsoever. The family trust remained exactly as my father had intended, protecting the business and providing for his grandson's education and future. 8 months later, both Savannah and Colton were sentenced at the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. Judge Rachel Green sentenced Colton to 3 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $400,000 in restitution. Savannah received 2 years and was ordered to pay an additional $300,000 in damages. Today, Clark Commercial Properties manages over $150 million in commercial real estate and employs 78 people. Marshall graduated with honors from DePaul and now heads our acquisitions division. Bryce is finishing his senior year and will join our legal compliance department next summer. We've created a scholarship fund in my father's name for students studying business ethics and commercial real estate management. The betrayal that began at my father's funeral ultimately strengthened everything he'd worked to build. Some people might call what happened revenge, but I prefer to think of it as accountability. When you run a company built on trust and financial responsibility, the truth always surfaces eventually. You just have to be patient enough to let it happen naturally.